Welcome to the Reasons to Reason podcast. I'm your host and captain, Sal Galati. This is the show that's going to talk about all the things we're not supposed to: God, religion, and politics. So strap in, prepare to get offended, and maybe, just maybe, our nation can learn how to reason again. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're going to enjoy today's little dose. This is essentially like a conversation I would have with someone at a party. And what I'm going to hopefully do here is get it all in, whereas in a party I kind of got to pick and choose based on how much time I have. But the topic's going to be evolution, origin of life. What is real? What have we been lied to about? Many times I'll meet people that they can acknowledge they've been lied to about a lot of things, by their government, by academia. But when it comes to this subject, they feel like this is untouchable. Like, well, no, they figured it out. They know how we got here. They'll just say evolution. They won't even take the time to understand what that word means. So we're going to parse out and have people realize what they've been told is mostly been debunked. And when you compare that with historical records, with the biblical narrative, you actually see that what the Bible actually says makes way more sense than what we've been told to in the schools. I'm going to cover a lot of material here. There's a work called Icons of Evolution by this man, Jonathan Wells. And picture the apes, for example, where you got the chimp to the ape man to the human, they're going up a ladder in height. That is one of the icons of evolution. These things that we've just been indoctrinated with there's no evidence to support that happened, but we just accept it as science, it'll appear at a museum. And it's just tragic. I want to make claims, it's going to sound condescending, but just hear me out. When I get in these conversations, I very, very, very rarely at this point hear anything new from someone who tells me that what I believe is false. I've considered and looked at all of them. I was indoctrinated with them myself. That's what I want people to get. I was a good student, and I received all these things and thought they were all proven too. It's only later in life when I started to look at them more critically, I realized, there's no evidence to supporting these things. Now, I'll tell them things that they've never heard. Whether they take the time to look into it themselves or not, that's not up to me. That's up to them, and whether they're seeking the truth or not. But I just wanted to put that out there. You're going to hopefully hear some things you haven't heard before, and then investigate them for yourself. That's all this is about. So let's dive in. So first, motive. Whenever there's a lie, we got to understand what the motive is. I did that episode with the forked tongue, perverters of speech. And really, when you have people seeking power, and that's their end goal, lying is going to be fine. So there is a motive to convince society and peoples that they're not made in the image of God. They actually came from primordial soup. And you may go well, Sal, how could I believe there's a God? We'll get into that. But just think fundamentally. Our country's founded on the fact that there is a God that gives us rights. It all hinges on that. And as they've slowly eroded that God exists, you have to come to terms with your rights then are only subject to the government in charge and the people in charge and the venal judges in charge to determine what rights you have and what rights you don't. So just as a logical thing, you need God to be there for us to have rights. But we could look at it more than that. We could derive that scientifically that God must exist. We talked about ChatGPT arriving at that conclusion. I pointed out to you the man with the highest IQ at this point has come to the same conclusion. So there is a motive to lie to people. They're much easily controlled, and they're much more subjugated to fear, like climate change fear, for example. So high level, the difference between macro and microevolution. So no one is debating the idea of microevolution, right? This is small changes within a species to adapt to their environment. This is what Darwin saw with his finches, that the beaks were different based on the food that they needed to eat. And he didn't observe this. Later on, experiments came on where when there was drought, the beaks changed a certain way to eat certain food, and when there was plentiful water and other things grew, and it changed very quickly. That's the point of it. And it takes millions of years to change. Now, from there, people have extrapolated out, well, that explains how everything could have come from one organism, which the science isn't there to support that. What it does support is that if you look at the biblical narrative, he created all the animals in kinds. So created a finch kind. And from that finch kind, many different finches have evolved. And that's fine. They haven't changed body plans. And we're going to talk about mutations and how mutations never, to the anatomy, never benefit. It's either it dies or it's a cripple. It never benefits the organism. And then macroevolution, which is the evolution that there is no scientific evidence for. It's all theoretical, and it's mostly been debunked. I mean, it is debunked. There is no evidence to support that organisms have changed body plans in all of the fossil record. Darwin thought they'd find it. They never found it. So let's go to Egypt, and I'll explain Egypt because sometimes these ideas that, we're so educated now, we understand how everything came to pass, and mostly the theory that we'll talk about with an experiment that's been debunked, the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment, but that we all started from a primordial soup. We have this soup with different types of salts in it, and a lightning might have struck it, and from there some proteins and amino acids, and then they strung together, and then they created a single-cell organism, and then from there we have life. It sounds like a fairy tale, but let's back it up. That's not such a novel idea. We're going to read now some of the creation stories from ancient Egypt. So I'm going to read from an article called Ancient Egypt Creation Myths, From Watery Chaos to Cosmic Egg. I'll put it in the show notes. The sun god Re was of paramount importance to the ancient Egyptians, and the sun's daily passage from east to west and its daily rising and setting served as a metaphor for the cycle of life, from birth to adulthood to death to rebirth. Another of Re's important roles was of creator god. The sun's reappearance on the horizon at dawn each day was a symbol of the recreation of the world. However, Re was not the sole creator god in Egypt mythology. The Egyptians had several elaborate myths describing the origins of their world. Each of these creation stories was centered at a different city. The Hermopolitan cosmology arose of the site of Hermopala in Middle Egypt. So here, in this myth, there was the Ogdoad, which consisted of 4 frog-headed male gods and their serpent-headed female counterparts. The divine group represented the dark, watery, unknown, and eternal state of the cosmos prior to creation. Nun and Nanhut represented water. He and Hahut expressed the notion of infinity. Kek and Kakut stood for darkness. Amun and Amunet reflected the concept of hiddenness. The 8 gods existed within the watery chaos of the pre-creation. With this unchanging nothingness, there was a potential for creation. The Egyptians believed that from these 8 gods came a cosmic egg that contained the deity responsible for creating the rest of the world, including the primeval mound, the first land to arise out of the waters of pre-creation. And you could look it up and read more from your own, but the point is, even back then in ancient Egypt, the prevailing theory was that life sprouted from a watery chaos, that there were gods in the water. And, obviously different now, but still, that's where the secular mind is taking us to say that's where the origin came from. Now, sticking on Egypt for a little bit, we have the plagues of Egypt that are documented in the Bible. There's a papyrus I want to point you to called the Ipuwer Papyrus. And this is outside of the Bible, and it has strikingly similar references to the plagues that are documented in the Bible. They give a lot of credibility and validity to the plagues that are documented in the Bible. I'm going to read a few. I'll put a link in the show notes. Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere, the river is blood. Men shrink from tasting, human beings and thirst after water. All animals, their hearts weep, the cattle moan. There's a plague about the livestock being hit with sores. Forsooth, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. Lower Egypt weeps, the entire palace is without revenues. To it belong wheat and barley, geese and fish. The land is without light. Forsooth, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. Lower Egypt weeps. The entire palace is without its revenues. To it belong by right wheat and barley, geese and fish. So that's not terribly important for this conversation, but I just want to point out to you it's fascinating. I don't know if you've heard of that in school, but it's worth checking into. So let's take what is said in Exodus. The claim is that God reveals this to Moses as to how the creation actually happened. And that's why, and then historically he wrote Genesis, which gives us the creation narrative. Put this against now the narrative that the Egyptians were going with, that there was this sun god who was like the creator god, and then there was these other gods hanging out in the watery abyss, and from the chaos of the watery abyss, life sprung. And God just corrected the narrative, going, no, this is how it works. And interestingly, all the gods in the Egyptian model are all created gods. They all had an origin, whereas the God of the Bible, what's revealed, we talked about it, it's mind-blowing that this could have just come from human conception, that actually the creator God is eternal. That explains everything. If he's eternal, things can spring forth from him, and there's no need to have an explanation of where he came from. So put that in historical context of what God is revealing to his people when he pulls them out of Egypt and these fake religions. And I would argue that's what we're being taught in the schools right now, are fake religions.
Are you looking for an affordable Christian education for your children that supports your values? For 20 years, Classical Consortium Academy has been doing just that. With 2 days of classical Christian instruction on campus and the rest at home, CCA's hybrid model gives you the best of both worlds, a deep learning and time together. And this fall, CCA is opening a brand new Glenview campus at Cornerstone Church. Discover the education you've been praying for at classicalconsortiumacademy.org. Enroll today.
I'm going to read from Letter to the Romans from Paul. This is written about 2,000 years ago. And he's trying to convict people that everything you need to know that whether or not God exists is all available to you. God has revealed it to you. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. You know, we talked about power versus truth and what are people's aspirations. Are they seeking power or are they seeking the truth? It's all evident. You look at the creation, it's evident. You have to explain it away that it was created. It's evident that it was created. And so you're suppressed the truth when you say it wasn't. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely the eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. You look at stuff in creation and it's evident. It's been created. So they're without excuse. Now, here's the important part. For although they knew God, like the Egyptians did, they know that there's got to be something to explain how we got here. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resemble mortal man, birds, animals, and creeping things. So they exchanged the eternal God for idols, fake gods, frogs and serpents. And are we much different today? Let's make it a more modern example. I would say the people that worship the stars, they want to know what your sign is. People ask me, I know what my sign is, but when people ask me, I go, I don't know, because I don't want to even open up that door. What a silly, you mock me for believing this Bible, yet you're looking at how many people are cancer in different ages, in different parts of the world. How could the horoscope explain their life? You see the silliness of it? But it's religion. So I want to introduce you to one more article, concept, thing to think about, and it also demonstrates this idea of the secular religions. Earth Day as a holiday. And there's an article that I'll post, and it's very fascinating. It talks about the origin of Earth Day, the people behind it, and really what have they said and what's going on. I'll read some excerpts from it. Earth Day celebrations have now been promoted in our schools, parks, communities for nearly 50 years. Cloaked in the veil of environmental awareness and championed by a Save the Planet mantra, Earth Day has become one of the most successful indoctrination campaigns for modern paganism and the worship of Gaia, or Mother Earth. Tucked nicely into the overarching theme of Earth Day are core pagan beliefs such as the veneration of Mother Earth, the reduction of human population, the introduction of, and even the criminalization for man's contribution to climate change. Earth Day's genesis can be traced back to a 1967 essay written by Lynn White Jr. titled The Historical Roots of an Ecological Crisis, and I'll read some excerpts from it. Progressive thinkers must change the way they view the relationship between mankind and Mother Earth. His suggestion, of course, was to embrace our pagan roots and replace archaic, destructive Christian beliefs with a newfound veneration of nature and nature's spirits. Christianity's absolute contrast of ancient paganism and Asia's religions. The spirits and natural objects which formerly had protected nature from man evaporated. Man's effective monopoly on spirit in the world was confirmed, and the old inhibitions to the exploitation of nature crumbled. In other words, the Patriarch Earth Day movement believed that the full conviction until Earth's society returned to a pagan worship of nature and Mother Earth, mankind would inevitably destroy its own sacred environment. So if you don't believe Earth Day is purely a religious movement, here's another quote from White's essay, which was premiered in the very first Earth Day manifesto in 1970. Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature that no solution for ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are largely religious, the remedy must also essentially be religious. Whether we call it that or not, we must rethink and refeel our nature and our destiny. So this is all making the assumption that the biblical narrative is like man rules over everything and just pummels it and destroys it. This is a lie, and this is not the approach that the Bible takes. We're to steward over our environment. Actually, the word husbandry, let's see, they haven't changed the definition of this word yet. I'll read you the definition of husbandry, what it means. The act or practice of cultivating crops and breeding and raising livestock. The application of scientific principles to agriculture, especially to animal breeding, careful management or conservation of resource economy. So that's husbandry. That's what we're called to do in the Bible. So in case you didn't know where that word came from. So how are people interested in power and not truth exploited this. Let's take modern day politicians like AOC. Our planet is going to face disaster if we don't turn the ship around. There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead young people to have a legitimate question, is it okay to still have children? Article goes on, but it's just to show you the connection. And actually the promulgators of the religion said it's a religion and we need to treat it like a religion. All it is back to Egypt, back to paganism, back to worshiping the creation like Paul warned about. And as Israel was taken out and God revealed to them, no. You didn't come by accident. You didn't just evolve. You didn't just appear out of nothing. I made you in the image of God to steward over everything. Don't believe these silly stories about things coming out of water. So let's remember that today. And now we'll go into the icons of evolution because, look, if I'm wrong or if the Bible's wrong, so be it. But does the evidence really say that we're wrong? So we're going to start with, and there's several of these, but I'm going to pick like 3-4 of them and I'll put some links and you guys can look at the others. I'm going to start with like the very common one. Everyone's seen that picture of like the chimp going to like the ape man going into the man, that progression. It's at all of our natural museums. It's in our textbooks. The problem is, and a lot of people look at that and go, you have a conversation with them. Oh yeah. They prove, they know, they figured it out. They proved. Just dig a little bit. They don't know anything. That image, there's no scientific evidence for it. Essentially, they've created a story about how it happened, and now they find evidence to fit into it. One thing I want to mention is just have a big picture look at as this evidence that we look at. If you're going into the laboratory already assuming there is no God, you're not doing pure science. You've created the narrative, you decided what the truth is, and now you're trying to prop up your narrative through bits of fossils or evidence. So let's take it apart. There's no evidence of these transitional forms. Now they see similarities, obviously, in the body plan, but that doesn't inherently say we evolve from it. It could also just mean that we have a common designer. It's a plan that actually works. And so when God created, he created, mammals have a heart, mammals have a brain, mammals have limbs that either walk or function as arms. But that doesn't mean they all evolve from the same thing. It's a false conclusion. So we talk about like Neanderthal and all these things. Like, how do we really know they're different? You could find people today that have faces that seem to be like they look like Neanderthal. You could have pygmy skeleton next to a Norseman, and you dig them up and go, oh, obviously these are different. They must have evolved from each other. They're not the same species. When we just look at bones, there's very little we could determine. But when you look at the pictures that they take at the museum, you have these ape-like creatures that now have like blue eyes and they smile and they have like human expression. And then many times they'll say, oh, well, Neanderthal was mating with Homo sapien, which is us. Well, if the species are mating, they maybe are the same species, right? Cats can't mate with dogs, no matter how hard you try. They look similar, but they can't mate with each other. So within a species, if they can mate, that's what makes it a species. So all these assumptions that we evolved, there's a variety of creatures that are human, and they look very different. So a couple examples, they found this one called Ida, that they saw, it was actually a lemur, and they said it was a transitional form, blah, blah, blah. Big campaign, big release, 6 months of propping it up, and then they released the science, and even evolutionary biologists go, this is not what you said it is. So, but the biggest arguments against this theory is there's no mechanism to explain this progression, all right? So you'll say natural selection, but all we know about natural selection is changes within kinds, which is what the Bible allows for, that the great designer made organisms within kinds and had all the information in there to evolve to meet their environment. That's completely fine with the biblical narrative, that dogs evolved into different kinds of dogs depending on their environment, that the finches evolved from different finches depending on the environment, depending on the stresses applied to them. And then mutations, and we'll talk about mutations later with another experiment with the mutant fruit flies that grew extra wings. Mutations never form new organs that are functional or body plans that work. So there is no mechanism to explain this story that you've heard. So there's another experiment with mutant fruit flies. So the textbooks still have this in their books. And that's the thing about these icons. They've been disproven, but they still appear in the modern day high school textbooks presented as factual. And the teachers aren't even aware that they're not legitimate anymore. So it's asking, like, why is this religion still being funded by our public schools? There's an experiment where fruit flies were manipulated by man to grow an extra pair of wings as evidence that DNA mutations can supply raw materials for evolution, even though the extra wings have no muscles and the disabled mutants couldn't survive outside the laboratory. So it was an experiment, and he accomplished his end by, I think, making 3 mutations. The fruit fly grew 2 extra wings, so it had 4 wings. But the second pair of wings actually were just dead weight, and it rendered the fruit fly a cripple. And that's the conclusion, is whenever we see a mutation, which is often an explanation for how evolution could occur, never has there been a mutation to the anatomy that was profitable. It either died or was defective, and no new body plan has ever come from a mutation or a new organ that was functional. The next icon I'm going to go through is called the Miller-Urey experiment, which was done in 1953. And this is the experiment where, you kind of get this primordial atmosphere, some gases, and they put an electric spark into it. And then they found that they created some amino acids from that. And from there they say building blocks of life could be developed by this pre-life Earth that existed. And I remember seeing this in my textbook, but there's some problems with the experiment that was later revealed not many years after. Notice, too, all these things, they have to be controlled by some free-thinking entity like a man in order to even make these experiments, which implies that there was a God, even if this is how it happened, that there was a God behind it, or there had to be some kind of mind behind it. But the problems with the experiment mainly was that the gas that they used probably weren't the early atmosphere. Mainly, they said there was no oxygen, which there probably was oxygen. And if there was oxygen, the whole thing would have exploded. There would have been no amino acids. And from now, what the gases that they think were there, which were CO2, nitrogen, and water vapor, you wouldn't get these results. But even if you could present an experiment and develop these amino acids, you're not solving anything. The complexity that we know of the human cell, or any cell of any organism, is that if you give any scientist all the bits of the cell, all the pieces, they can never put it together again to function as a functioning cell. There's no way to do it. And I'll put a link to Dr. James Tour, who does a lot of work on this, well-credentialed, tons of patents, amazing work he's done. He's a professor at Rice University, and he just does a ton of work on kind of chemistry and biology and how things could synthesize and come together. And he presents a ton of argumentation that the way they suggest it happen is an impossibility. But I'll let you dig into that yourself. So last 2 icons, and then we're going to bring this thing home. Vertebrate embryos. So you guys have seen these pictures of the embryos in the biology textbooks and proving that, essentially everything looked like the same in the origin. So these are still in the textbooks, even though biologists have known for over a century that vertebrate embryos are not most similar in early stages and the drawings are fake. So there was a German Darwinist, Haeckel, who made these drawings, and they were used as evidence that we did have common descent because they saw a lot of similarities in the embryos of different vertebrates, organisms with a backbone. The drawings are fake, and his peers at the time accused him of that. But in 1997, a British biologist compared the drawings to reality and proved them to be fake. He also, not only that, the similarities that he did show, he was very selective in which organisms he picked and which ones he left out. So how do I know this is true? Well, they are slowly but surely removing these pictures from the textbooks. Even though many of my peers, people are 40 years old or so, they got it built in their mind that this is true. And now, in modern-day textbooks, sometimes they do replace them with actual photos, not just the drawings that Haeckel faked. But even then, it's very cherry-picked to kind of paint a narrative. Again, we're all got to look at this as like, what's the story you subscribe to? What's the religion you adopted? And then are you trying to find the truth, or are you trying to prop up your religion? So this guy, Jonathan Wells, was attacked, but his primary field of study is embryology, and he's got a PhD from Berkeley. But people that didn't have degrees in that were attacking him as a quack, because he said, well, this has been debunked. And while they even attack him, then out of the other side of their fork-tongued mouth, they say, well, no one took these pictures ever seriously. And like, again, I said, they're removing them from the textbooks, which is a demonstration that they know they're not good science. So the final one, and then we'll wrap it up, is the Tree of Life. Darwin's Tree of Life. It's the only actual drawing in his book, Origin of Species. And Darwin said, if he was correct, the fossil record would show that there was a common ancestor and then these innumerable steps in between. Well, the problem is, like, these transitional forms don't exist. They just don't exist in a fossil record. And actually what we see in a fossil record, it's called the Cambrian explosion. Now, whether you believe the Earth is very old or relatively young, it doesn't matter. But almost immediately at a point in time, many body plans form at one time with no common ancestor. They just kind of appear. And that's obviously something that jives with the biblical narrative, but it doesn't support his. And again, I'm just giving you a taste of all these icons. There's many more. I'm going to put some links up. And here's the grand summary, right? This isn't about me being insecure and I have to be right. I'm always just pursuing the truth. If I'm wrong, so be it. But to those who just roll their eyes immediately with no information, no education on the topic, you certainly understand that you've been lied to about certain things. Why can't you have been lied to about this? It all rolls up into the same grand lie from the great grand deceiver, the devil himself. So I hope you learned something today. Hope you enjoy it. Hope you think about it. Push yourself to learn. Encourage some conversations with friends and family. And I wish you peace.
Sing it!
Thanks for joining us for another episode. I hope I got you thinking and out of your comfort zone. Believe me, the biggest fear your government has is a population that is thinking and talking to one another. So get out there, take a risk, start a conversation, make a friend, and reason with each other. Share the show with someone who you think needs to hear it. I wish you peace and love.